And I am just waiting for the live on YouTube to start, and then we should be good to go.
Is this all college kids, Cubby?
Yes. So we got 108 of them on 109. You can see the number in the lower left. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. We were having some technical issues. My name is Kobe Rizek, and I'm the president of the William F. Buckley Jr. program at Yale. Welcome to this Zoom firing line debate on the Department of Justice's Yale investigation and the future of affirmative action in higher education. Before I introduce our moderator and our two guests more formally, I want to say a few words about the Buckley program. First, for those of you who don't know, the William F. Buckley Jr. program is an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We do so in a variety of ways, including hosting lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates like this one, as well as an annual conference. Our over 300 Buckley Fellows have a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious conservative thought, the Buckley program forwards its mission of a more open and more representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives, including those of the right, must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website, buckleyprogram.com. All Yale undergraduate and graduate students are eligible. And if you're a fellow now, please share this opportunity with your peers. Also, please mark your calendars for next Wednesday, October 28th at 4:30 p.m. when the Buckley program will host Dr. Victor Davis Hanson for a lecture on the strangest year, 2020. Now on to our esteemed moderator and guest this afternoon. Our moderator, Lisa Blatt, serves as chair of Williams and Connolly's Supreme Court and Appellate Practice. Lisa has argued 40 cases before the United States Supreme Court, prevailing in 37. The National Law Journal has called her a visionary and one of the 100 most influential lawyers in America. Bloomberg has described her as a legendary high court litigator, while the National Journal likewise has referred to her as a SCOTUS legend. Lisa's appellate work has been highlighted by multiple publications and has earned her rankings in Chambers USA, Benchmark Litigation, the Legal 500, and Washingtonian Magazine. In 2020, Benchmark Litigation selected Lisa as one of the top 10 women in litigation in the United States. Her oral advocacy has been cited as exemplary in the Supreme Court Clerk's Guide for Counsel in Cases to be Argued before the Supreme Court. She also serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown Law School. Ms. Blatt received both her BA and JD at the University of Texas. Kevin Carey is the Vice President for Education Policy and Knowledge Management at New America and directs the education policy program there. He writes regularly for The Upshot at the New York Times and has written featured articles for Wired, The New Republic, Pacific Standard, Washington Monthly, and other publications. He's a contributing writer for the Chronicle of Higher Education and edits the annual Washington Monthly College Guide. His book, The End of College, Creating the Future of Learning in the University of Everywhere, was published by Riverhead in 2015. Mr. Carey has a bachelor's degree from Binghamton University and a master's degree from the Ohio State University. Heather McDonald is the Thomas W. Smith Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, a contributing editor of City Journal and a New York Times bestselling author. She's a recipient of the 2005 Bradley Prize. McDonald's work at City Journal has covered a range of topics, including higher education, immigration, policing, homelessness, and homeless advocacy, criminal justice reform, and race relations. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the New Republic, and the New Criterion. Ms. McDonald's newest book, The Diversity Delusion, How Race and Gender Pandering Corrupt the University and Undermine Our Culture, argues that toxic ideas first spread by higher education have undermined humanistic values, fueled intolerance, and widened divisions in our larger culture. She received a BA in English from Yale University, a master's degree in English from Cambridge University, and a law degree from the Stanford University School of Law. As far as format this afternoon, each guest will begin with a 5-minute opening statement and then alternate in giving 2-minute maximum answers to questions from our moderator and some from the audience if we end up having time. So with that, please join me in welcoming our 3 guests this afternoon to the Buckley program. Ms. Blatt, I'm going to turn off my camera and you are welcome to take over as moderator.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Buckley, and thank you for everyone tuning in. I'm so excited. You guys are incredibly impressive. I'm not sure who's starting. Do you guys know which one of you is first?
I had put up my hand, but I'm happy to reverse if we want to do that.
And I will loosely keep time. So this is not the Supreme Court where they cut you off and escort you from the courtroom if you go over.
Not the debates either tonight. So thank you very much. Okay, I'll start. Thank you so much, Kobe and Lisa, for hosting this. And it's a great privilege, as always, to be among Yale students and within this great institution. The traditional argument against racial preferences rests on equity. It is not fair, it is said, and arguably not constitutional, to treat different groups of students differently based on their race. Today, however, I'm going to make a different case. Racial preferences, on average, handicap rather than help their alleged beneficiaries, an issue known as mismatch. First of all, let me state as clearly as possible, I and other critics of racial preferences are not saying that underrepresented minorities should not go to college. We are saying that the beneficiaries of racial preferences should attend college under the same conditions as their non-preferred peers, admitted to those thousands of fine schools for which they are academically competitive. Let me also say that I would be happy to junk legacy preferences, which are much smaller in any case than racial preferences. The Yale litigation is in its earliest stages. The avalanche of previously concealed data that was pulled unwillingly out of Harvard during a similar lawsuit last year has yet to emerge. But we know enough already to rebut Yale's inevitable defense. Yale will argue that it treats an applicant's race allegedly as just one smallish plus factor among many helping him get admitted. While racial preferences are a plus for the preferred group, Yale will say they are not a negative for the unpreferred groups. None of these propositions is true. Race, in fact, hugely determines admissions odds for different racial groups at Yale and at every other selective college. Yale evaluates applicants based on a standardized academic index that combines SAT scores and high school GPA. The chart on your screen divides applicants into deciles based on their academic index. Students in the top 10th decile have an index score higher than 90% of other applicants. Students in the first decile have an index score below 90% of other applicants. Yale admits 6% of Asians in the 8th academic decile and 8% of whites. It admits 49% of Black applicants in that decile, giving Black applicants an 8 times greater chance of admission than similarly situated Asians and a 6 times greater chance of admission than whites. Asians and whites in the 3rd decile have less than a 1% chance of admission. Blacks in that 3rd decile have a 6 times greater chance of admission than whites and Asians. The result of these different admission standards is a disparate distribution of academic skills. 41% of Black admits are in the bottom half of their class, compared to 9% of Asians and 13% of whites. Nearly twice as many Asian students as Black admits are in the top 4 deciles of the academic index. Now, why does this matter? Let's take the question out of a racial context. If MIT admitted me to get its gender diversity up, and I had math SATs of 650, whereas most of my peers were close to 800, I would likely struggle in my first year STEM classes because those classes would be pitched towards a level of academic preparation that I had not yet reached. If, however, I had attended, let's say, Boston College, a perfectly respectable school, where my academic index matched that of my peers, I would have a much greater chance of sticking with a STEM major and graduating because the teaching would be pitched at my level of incoming skills. This phenomenon of mismatch has been documented repeatedly in STEM. Duke University, for example, admits Black students whose academic qualifications are a standard deviation below that of their white and Asian peers. As a result, there is a flight among Black freshmen who intended to major in STEM out of the STEM fields and into softer majors. Had those racially preferred students attended, say, the University of North Carolina, again, a well-regarded school, they would be more likely to graduate with a STEM degree and go on to a career in science. The mismatch phenomenon has been further documented in law schools, where after the first year, 51% of Black law students nationally are in the bottom 10th of their class compared to 5% of white students. Only 45% of Black law graduates pass the bar on their first try compared to 80% of whites. These different outcomes are not inevitable. They are the result of catapulting one group of students into an academic environment for which they are less competitive. There are plenty of underrepresented minorities nationwide who would be admitted to the most selective schools based on the same academic criteria as whites and Asians. Without preferences, their numbers would be lower in the most competitive schools, but they would face no questions about whether their race compensated for an academic profile that would otherwise be disqualifying. In summary, colleges cannot simultaneously argue that racial preferences are a minor factor in admissions, and also that without racial preferences, their entire project of diversity would be foiled. Either preferences are determinative in admissions or they are not. The data, as well as colleges' own logic, show that preferences are determinative for a great portion of admissions outcomes. But such preferences paper over the reason why they are believed to be necessary in the first place, the academic skills gap. We've just learned that only 4% of Black high school seniors were rated college ready on all 4 subject areas of the 2020 ACT test. Closing that gap should be the focus of public policy. In the meantime, students should be admitted to college on a colorblind basis, which would give all students the greatest likelihood of academic success. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing Mr. Kevin's rebuttal. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather, and I just want to say thanks to the Buckley Society for inviting me to come and participate in this. I'm sorry under the circumstances I couldn't make the trip up to New Haven, but this is great nonetheless. I'm going to make a few points to start, and then I think we'll get into it in the debate. First, just to be clear, racial preferences in college admissions are constitutional. A series of Supreme Court decisions spanning 4 decades have found that student body diversity is a, quote, compelling state interest that can justify the use of race in admissions. Second, using race and ethnicity in college admissions, particularly for traditionally underrepresented students, primarily Black and Latino students, is both smart and just. Smart because we know that there are, in addition to systemic racism in many facets of society, we have a K-12 education system that does not provide equal opportunities to students of different races. We systematically provide less funding to schools that serve high proportions of minority students. So we don't get a complete picture of their potential in college, nor is their potential fixed by those experiences. As for the Department of Justice complaint against Yale University, I certainly do not have the legal credentials of either Ms. McDonald or our esteemed moderator. It is, in my opinion, kind of a hot mess. Not quite the level of pure trolling that we saw from the Department of Education recently that decided to investigate Princeton University for daring to admit that it still has work to do on racism. But all you really see in the complaint filed by the Department of Justice is a very kind of anodyne description of an admissions process that Yale shares with many, many other, virtually all selective universities, in which race is a factor. And its only complaint is that based on one point of comparison, the academic index that Ms. McDonald mentioned, that the Department of Justice thinks that it does it too much. To which I would say, you should go and be the president of Yale or run for the board of trustees if you disagree with their judgment. But the fact of the matter is that as an independent, private, nonprofit institution, this is the judgment that Yale University has made. It is not uncommon. It's not excessive. In fact, it's common practice for colleges and universities that are universally regarded as some of the best in the world. The whole question of mismatch kind of comes up, and I imagine we'll get a chance to dig into this a little more. A lot of the argument against affirmative action comes down to this mismatch hypothesis, which has gotten a lot of attention. It's pretty counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense at all if you believe in markets, as I would think that many people on the more conservative side of things do. You would imagine that if the mismatch hypothesis was real, it would be self-correcting, and that students of color would not choose to apply to colleges in which they are likely to be less successful. But in fact, we know now it's not true. I wrote an article for the New York Times just a couple of months ago about a major study that was released very recently looking at the effects of the Proposition 209, which was a proposition in California in 1996 that outlawed affirmative action in public colleges and universities. The problem with a lot of the mismatch research is that it doesn't have a control group and it doesn't have a counterfactual. You look at a group of students, but you really don't know what would have happened to them under different circumstances. This study actually has both of those things in the sense that it uses the kind of sideways event of imposing a new public policy on a system at a fixed point in time to do what's called a difference in difference analysis. And so you can see what happened before and after the implementation of that policy. And in fact, it found that in addition to having really severe effects on the enrollment of Black and Hispanic students in the University of California system over time, it pushed them down the ladder of selectivity. The University of California has 9 campuses of varied selectivity, with UCLA and UC Berkeley being the most selective. So essentially, we saw much less enrollment in those institutions, and then the students who didn't get into, would have gotten in under the old system, but couldn't under the new one, were pushed down the ladder, and then those students were pushed down the ladder, and some students were pushed off the ladder. Now, mismatch hypothesis would tell you that was a good thing for those students, that they were matched more appropriately with institutions that were more able to serve them and were going to match them with peers that had the same level of academic ability. If that were true, we should have seen an increase in the performance of Black and Hispanic students, in especially the kind of challenging science and math classes that were referred to. In fact, that didn't happen at all. There was no improvement. There was no improvement in course taking. There was no improvement in grades. There was a decline in the number of students who graduated with degrees in so-called STEM fields. And that in turn, led to a decline in earnings and so on and so forth over time. So this study, which again is brand new and really upsets a lot of the conventional wisdom in the field, I think is really a devastating blow against the mismatch hypothesis, which again never really made a ton of sense to begin with. It was always counterintuitive. So I think we kind of find ourselves at a point where the evidence is pretty clear that affirmative action is good for the students. It is meant to help. It is, again, constitutional over a long series of decisions. And unless you think that the federal government and the Department of Education ought to be going through admissions files one by one and substituting the judgment of Washington bureaucrats for the people at your university and elsewhere for who really belongs there, it will continue to be and should be common practice in American higher education.
Okay. All right, you both went over the 5 minutes by a lot, but so I think we're going to move into the rebuttal, and then we'll have a series of questions.
Well, first of all, regarding the study that Kevin was talking about, the author has not released the data. It's secret. He got access to it. Richard Sander and others have been trying to get access to this data for years. UC has not provided it. Contrary to all the norms of academic discourse and debate, UC is still not releasing it. His facial charges are simply not supported by what we already know. The number of underrepresented minorities in UC did not go down. In fact, the percentage graduating with a STEM degree increased by a third over the period that he looked at. So we did see, in fact, what you would exactly presuppose with that reorganizing of students into schools for which they were matched. What I find amazing about the defense of affirmative action is the snobbery entailed by it. I remember when Prop 209, the measure that did attempt to end racial preferences throughout California government, including in the university system, was passed. The chancellor of Berkeley said, how will we ever find the leaders of California's tomorrow without racial preferences? Assuming that somebody who went instead of Berkeley to say University of California, Santa Cruz or University of California, Irvine, future was over, that the only way you could have a successful life would be to attend the very elite schools. That is simply not the case. There are fine educations to be had throughout the academic spectrum. What getting rid of preferences do is, again, rejigger students so that everybody is facing a similar set of challenges for which he is prepared. Kevin is right. There are inequities in school capacities throughout the country. Nevertheless, research has shown that academic indexes combining GPAs and SATs are predictive. Black students actually do worse than their SATs would predict. If SATs were somehow flawed, they would do better than the SATs would predict. That's simply not the case. Kevin is also right, of course, that the court has 4 times already declared racial preferences constitutional. I would argue that the jurisprudence under which it has done so is an embarrassment. It should make any self-respecting judge blush with shame because it is filled with patent fictions and simple absurdities, such as the fact that there is no zero-sum game in admissions, that you can use preferences to favor one group without disfavoring another group. In fact, it is always a zero-sum game. And I would return to the equity argument, which is that it is simply unfair to students who are disfavored. But I also think most powerfully, it is not doing the best academically to students who enter under much, much different economic preparation than their peers.
I want to address the Bliemer study a little bit. One, it's not secret data, it's individual data. And that's what gives the study its power. It's based on a file of every single person who applied to the University of California over the course of 8 years, matched to where they went to college, their grades, their earnings, all kinds of things. So because it's personal data, the state of California and the university system can't just make it available on the internet as it could for the kind of summative data that the Department of Education or university systems normally release. So he's not the only person who has access to this data. I expect it will be evaluated and kind of different people will kind of get to kick the tires, but it's not secret. Second, this question of trends over time is important. I want to take a second to talk about this. Prop 209 was one thing that happened in the middle of the 1990s, but a lot of other things were happening also. The state of California was getting larger. The state of California was getting more ethnically and racially diverse. Demand for the University of California system admissions was going up both within the state and for students coming from out of the state. So all of those other factors were pushing minority enrollment up, and they were pushing minority attainment up. Prop 209, on the other hand, very much pushed it down. So what any competent, what Mr. Bliemer did is what any competent economist would do is statistically control for all the other things and find just the effect of the affirmative action. So there is no contradiction between the overall trends and the study's effect of Prop 209. The study properly controls for those things to understand what the effect of that was. I do also want to kind of get back a little bit to the Department of Justice complaint. I would note that both my partner in this debate and the Department of Justice are kind of cherry picking the data. They picked the one decile where there's the biggest disparity between admission rates for Asian and Black students. It's actually quite a bit lower at the very top decile, where students are most likely to get in. And in fact, a true fact, in the bottom decile, white students are more likely to get in than Black students by a little bit, which suggests that the system of legacy admissions and people who aren't that bright somehow finding their way into Ivy League colleges that mostly benefits white people is alive and well on some level. So again, I don't think that the mismatch hypothesis is supported. This new study is just far, far more powerful and far, far more detailed. You can read kind of about all those things. One last thing I will say, we haven't really talked about this, but it's worth saying. I do think, maybe this is one point of agreement between us. I do think that Yale and other Ivy League schools do discriminate against Asian students. I do think, the complaint lumps them together. It says Asian and white students. I think the idea that Yale discriminates against white students is laughable, given both the sports preferences and the legacy and giving us a lot of money preferences that we know the system works. I do think there is an element of discrimination against Asian students, very resonant of the way that Ivy League colleges discriminated against Jewish students 100 years ago. It was morally indefensible then, it's morally indefensible now.
Can I just quickly respond? The data is secret. He hasn't released it. Of course, it needs to be anonymized. Richard Sander, who is the premier empirical scholar that's working on mismatch, has spent years begging, filing requests to the UC system for its data set, of course, under anonymous conditions. The fact of the matter is that they are not releasing the data to other scholars who could check his work. As far as the complaint being thin, Kevin's right, it is very, very thin. It uses a set of generalized statements throughout. The only detail is the chart, the academic decile chart, but that's because it's the first complaint. That's because colleges fight tooth and nail to keep their admissions processes completely opaque. It is a black box that gives enormous amounts of discretion to preening college high school admissions officers who fancy themselves as crafting some utopian community. If it has very little data in it, that's because have not even begun the discovery process. And what came out during the Harvard litigation was utterly damning. So if Yale wants to defend its admissions process, it should have all of that data available. It should, and colleges generally should publish data both on the average scores, academic index of their students, and on where they graduate, major preferences coming in, where students end up graduating, from what fields they end up graduating, and GPAs. That would allow us, without having to file these complaints, to understand in more detail what the process of college admissions really looks like.
So let me pause so we can get into some questions. Just sort of an overview to catch you up on the state of the Supreme Court jurisprudence. Having been a UT graduate, I've been following this for some time. The last two Fisher cases all turned on the top 10 plan and Justice Kennedy, and the court has changed since then. And the last time the court really took on Bakke was in the Grutter case with the swing vote of Justice O'Connor, who said that the need for the compelling state interest would expire. I think we have 8 years left. Set up this artificial deadline that everybody thought was silly, but that was the last word on the subject. I read the Yale complaint as a placeholder to kick it to the next administration. If there's a Biden administration, presumably that complaint will be dismissed, and all the action will be on the Harvard lawsuit, which the people who brought that lawsuit, and I forgot his name, Ed is his first name, the man who brought the lawsuit both at Harvard and at UT, didn't bring it under existing jurisprudence. He brought it because he knows he's got a different court. And so regardless of what the First Circuit holds in that case, he's betting on it going to the Supreme Court. that it'll be a different court when it gets there. There'll be a 6-3 conservative court, which seems to me inconceivable that that's a favorable audience to bring up the problem. And the fundamental paradox. So mismatch has gotten no play in the Supreme Court. It was briefed in Grutter, it was briefed in the Fisher case, and only Justice Scalia bit on the mismatch, and I think he was shamed in the press because of that. But I think it makes even the conservatives very uncomfortable to go with mismatch. So I guess let me just start with just mismatch, because it's definitely one of the most controversial. Heather, would you, if the mismatch theory were correct, would you feel like that would be okay to keep women out of school too, or the LGBTQ community, if there were statistics that women were not succeeding, that schools should just say, well, you know, so what if we have all male colleges? Would you extend that?
Yeah, I would admit on an absolutely neutral basis, I would not give these vast amounts of discretion to college admissions officers. I think that academic preparedness should be the overriding consideration. Again, nobody's saying what preferences do is simply shift around. The number of students going to colleges nationwide would remain the same. It's just that for those groups of preferred students, rather than being bumped up uniquely among all college students to one rank or more, and the mismatch grows larger and larger the further you go down the rankings of schools. At Harvard and Yale, there still is a considerable amount of mismatch. We found out through the Harvard admission that Harvard's current Black student population is 14%. Without racial preferences, it would be less than 1%. And Harvard has the cream of the crop of all national students graduating. So its preferences are the most small. Yale's are also small. But as you go down, the gap gets larger and larger. And if it turns out that females are being admitted under preferences, I would get rid of those too. Again, in that example I gave, I would not want to go to MIT when I was not competitively qualified with my peers. It would be a horrible situation. I would be greeted with a diversity bureaucracy that would convince me to blame any academic difficulties I might be feeling on a campus rape culture, the patriarchy, instead of being honest about the fact that I had been put into an academic environment for which I was not prepared, even though I was prepared for a host of other really fine institutions where I would have a much greater chance of sticking with my initial intending major.
So Kevin, let me just switch to you, even though I have to follow up on that, but I want to make sure we're providing equal time, not based on a mismatch, but a pure egalitarian concept here. Kevin, in terms of, again, what I find the paradox, which is the fault of Bakke, which is that reparations is not a legitimate basis for affirmative action. It seems therein is the problem, is once you take out the real reason why most people are for affirmative action is one, to rectify systemic differences, but this notion of compelling state interest in diversity. When you have to take that side, which I think is the side you're taking, what is it about the race, other than a stereotype, that adds to the college experience? Is it that there's a certain association with race that makes the academic environment richer, based on nothing else other than the color of the skin?
Well, it's, of course, your experience is not a function of the color of your skin. I think these colleges deeply believe that their job is to provide a world-class educational environment for their students. And they think that an important part of that is being exposed to, being in dialogue with, learning with people of diverse backgrounds. That means lots of things. It means where you're from. It means your religious background, your international background, your political affiliation. Yes, your race, yes, your ethnicity, lots and lots of things. You know, the academic index decile represents one point of view that colleges consider in terms of who they want to admit among many. And so, you know, Harvard absolutely, I think I can say, does not think that the best class at Harvard would have 1% Black students. They don't believe that. It's not who they are.
They believe it. They believe, like Yale, it should be the same percentage, one or more every year after year.
Well, I mean,
the statistics are a little bit odd in terms of other than when the lawsuit was filed at Harvard, then the number of Asians went up. But it is remarkable that the what is supposedly quota is now verboten and racial balancing is verboten, but the numbers do seem to be pretty constant. Is that because there's a perfect view of what a critical mass is, or what a view of what's a racially appropriate, college campus should look like?
I mean, there's a view. It is a very countable thing we're talking about, and you do sort of have to make decisions and balance these with kind of other factors. Again, I think the reason that the percentage of Asians went up is because, again, as I said, I think they had been discriminating against Asian students and said maybe we should do less of that. I mean, a lot of this is, as you say, kind of bound up in the kind of confused logic of Supreme Court jurisprudence. And I mean, this idea that the legal foundation is diversity, but that should have an expiration date, makes no sense at all. If you believe in diversity as an important educational value, that'll be true 100 years from now, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now. And there's, by the way, lots and lots of research to back this up. This isn't just some made up liberal idea. And students themselves don't want to go to college with people who are only just like them. So again, this is the judgment of these private nonprofit institutions, which implicitly people are advocating that the federal government should use its legal power to supersede. How, I have no idea how that would even happen, how you would kind of come in and go through what is inherently a holistic process that takes a lot of different things into account and then makes a judgment. But that's where they've landed so far. It's both their right and their prerogative as educators to do that.
Well, the simplest view is the Chiefs view. I mean, a purist view is if you ban, at least on a constitutional level, taking race into account, it's easy. You just bar, just like you can't count it as a minus factor, you can't count it as a plus factor. It seems the easiest is the bright line rule, which is to ban it in all contexts, which again is the paradox. So Heather, let me ask you because what was the prevailing argument to the conservatives, and was definitely one of the prevailing arguments in the recent LGBTQ case about whether Title VII should be extended to transgender status and same sex, was the judgment of, I think it was every corporation in America, maybe except for Walmart, but every corporation basically said they weighed in that case, but they said in the Grutter case, both military leaders and corporate leaders said schools have to serve society, and the Constitution has to be viewed through that lens. If it's true that, sure, there's state schools and that people could just go to state schools like I went to, and they don't have to go to Ivy League. That's one of the views. But if military leaders are telling schools like Yale and Harvard that they need to staff their officer ranks and their corporations and board members with people of color, is that not legitimate for universities to consider that in the end, maybe their job is not just purely academic, but it's to serve the society and the government that, is telling them what they need?
They serve society by educating students to the best of their capacity. I'm just stunned at the snobbery of this. They want to be able to credentialize, have students or military members that come out of a certain class of schools. If it's so handicapping to attend University of California at Riverside or Santa Cruz for Blacks, why don't we shut them down? Why should anybody have the handicap of attending those schools? Why doesn't everybody go to Harvard and Yale? There are good educations to be had everywhere. And what matters really is a student's motivation. On the point about, I hear a frequent complaint from students on campus, minority students, that they are looked to give the Black perspective on things during class. Well, you can't have it both ways. The diversity rationale argues that you're precisely there to give the Black perspective. So if that's the reason for which you've been admitted, you can't now disagree with it. I would argue that there is no Black perspective. There is no white perspective. I know conservative whites and liberal Blacks and liberal Blacks and conservative whites. Same with any kind of political outcome, religious outcome. There are far more important ways to create an intellectual diversity than essentializing race or gender to this extent, which pigeonholes people and I think does create a stigma on campus. We're fooling ourselves if we don't think that high school students are not completely aware of how this works. And there is a cynicism about the admissions process. Students compare SATs, they compare GPAs. They know that SATs and GPAs that would be automatically disqualifying for whites and Asians are still a pretty certain entry ticket for preferred Hispanics and Blacks. I don't think that's a good position to be in.
So Kevin, let me bring on that, because one of the arguments that got a lot of play in the Texas case was UT's claim that their overall numbers were good on minority status, but they didn't have enough classroom diversity. And that got pretty negative reaction. Would you extend that and think that schools should be able to say that we need to let in more of certain preferred minority populations to make sure that there's enough Blacks and Hispanics, say in STEM majors? Would you go to that level of granular detail to get diversity?
I mean, there are right now, colleges are doing a lot to try to recruit more.
I say recruit. I'm talking about distinctions based on race that add a plus to their application.
Like depending on their major that they might be going into. I mean, we don't really know. A lot of students don't declare their majors in their application process, right? So it would be that would be a hard system to implement. People change their minds. They kind of go from here to there. So that's
I take it the logic of your position is that the schools could actually racially balance the classroom because they have a legitimate interest in doing that. So they take the race into the account in the way they actually do the classroom. That would be okay with you?
I mean, schools are multitudinous. There are a lot of different things. They're not one institution. And so, I could imagine deciding that in some part of the institution, the way that you think about diversity and how that runs into admissions might be different. But again, that's not how the admission system works now. And so,
yeah, I'm just saying, I'm not sure that even had any votes on the Supreme Court. That at some level, even the liberals found that too distasteful. So no matter.
I do want to just make one point on this question about the zero-sumness of it, because this did, kind of comes up in the context of UT. Of course, it's true in a mathematical sense that if you decide ahead of time what the size of the class is, as selected institutions do, it's zero-sum, and I'm not going to disagree with that. It's not zero-sum from an outcomes perspective, however. There's been research that came out just last year looking at the UT system to sort of figure out, again, what is the effect of these policies? And what it finds is the top 10% system in Texas is better for the beneficiaries than it is bad for the people who lose out. So the students on the margin who get to go to a more selective institution benefit from that more than the students who are excluded because the system is in place. And that actually was also very consistent with the findings of the Bliemer Study, which found, again, there was an absolutely undeniable negative effect on Black and Hispanic students over time because of this. It's in every measure they found, earnings, graduation, going to graduate school, where you went, et cetera, et cetera. But looking at the most selective institution, largely absent for white and Asian students, because these are students who were bringing a lot to the table to begin with. And it appears that for the most part, they found someplace else where they could succeed just as well.
So let me expect to Heather on this mismatch theory, because one of the reasons it has not received much attention in the legal scholarship with justices is because there's some sort of disconnect with a white person saying this is really bad for Black people to give them preferences. And I think it makes a lot of people react negatively to that as a matter of Supreme Court jurisprudence. Do you have any other sort of moralistic kind of objection other than you think this is bad for the minorities who are subject to the preference? Is there some sense of, just, you know, a sense of just morality to it about something about discrimination because of race? Or is it really, you feel like this is just something that's bad for Black people and Hispanics, so we should help them, even if they don't want to be helped?
Well, I do think it is unfair if somebody has had a whole lifetime of hard work to be treated with different standards based on that person's race or ethnicity. I think that the government does have an obligation in all but the most clear circumstances where you do have a compensatory remedial role, as we saw in the early civil rights cases, where you had institutions that had a history of discrimination, quite recent. In those cases, orders for desegregation and affirmative action viewed as preferences as opposed to just outrage, those may have been justified. Currently, though, the idea that there's a single school in the country that is remotely discriminating against minorities is preposterous. The opposite is the case, as we see. The preferences run all in one direction. That goes for faculty hiring and preference and promotions as well. So I don't think we need this regime of explicit or, you know, hidden, but they are very obvious when you look at the numbers, quantitative racial preferences to overcome some deep-seated racism on the part of these institutions. So yes, I think colleges should be colorblind. I think they should be gender blind. I think they should look at people's, if you want to look at their accomplishments in order to craft a class, that's fine. But as I say, having read some of the stuff that's come out from college admissions offices during Ed Blum's lawsuits, he's got one now against University of North Carolina. Appalling. He quotes admissions officers talking about their little brown students and hoping that they can fiddle with the criteria for scholarships, because even though this little brown student is not academically qualified, let's figure out a way to get him. It is just unbelievably condescending. Who are these people in Harvard making judgments about the character of 16-year-olds? You know, do you really show the Harvard character? Give me a break. Students who reading this stuff should be absolutely nauseated by the power these people wield. I would make it as objective as possible. If we really believe in implicit bias as a massive problem in America, we should want to move to a system that takes implicit bias out, use the most objective criteria we can, and let the chips fall where they may. As I say, the real problem that nobody's discussing here is that there are very large academic skills gaps. Without those gaps, nobody would be talking about diversity. Diversity is a fig leaf so that we don't have to talk about how are we going to close those gaps, something we've been trying to do for decades that has not happened. But that is the problem. The problem is not any sort of discrimination on the part of colleges or universities.
Now you're reminding me of my first meeting with Ed Bloom. It was at a Heritage Foundation event. And I walked up to him and I said, stop picking on UT. Why don't you go after Harvard? I mean, go after these Ivy Leagues. What are you doing? And he goes, oh, I sued Harvard. So I was like, okay. Kevin, if I went out on a limb here and told you that I thought that Harvard is going to face an uphill battle in the Supreme Court, what should universities do if they're told, I don't think they will ever go on a mismatch theory, but if they're just told the system that they created is a mess because universities have never been able to link up the compelling state interest with the critical mass and kind of justifying it on the strict scrutiny they've set up. And if they start over and just say, you have to use race neutral alternatives, what will Ivy League institutions and state schools do? And what can they do? Can they not use zip codes and socioeconomic status and essays? Why do they have to even do? I think what is so distasteful to the conservative is the notion of a plus it's the physicality of seeing something next to an applicant based on race that is, it's very grating to them as a constitutional matter. So is there something else the universities can do that doesn't implicate that kind of, you know, raw discrimination on the basis of race?
I mean, they can't just use economics, because economics and race aren't the same thing. People of color experience very specific, their experience is very specific, often very negative, because of their race, irrespective of their economic class. Those things overlap, but they are not the same. One is not the substitute for the other. I mean, look, colleges, so it's a pretty dystopian idea to think that of all the different things other than academic merit, the colleges use to admit students, the one that we're going to rule is unconstitutional is for underrepresented minority students. I mean, Yale University right now, we're a year away from the soccer coach selling a spot on the women's soccer team for $1.2 million. So apparently there are enormous admissions preferences built into an athletic system that I'm sure many of us read the article in The Atlantic this week is completely dominated by affluent white people as a way to kind of get around economic merit. The universities still have a system where if you donate money, you get a plus factor. That came out of the Harvard lawsuit. There is still, of course, a sort of just plain power part of this whole thing. And there's still legacy admissions. I mean, Yale is 50 years removed from being not any kind of meritocracy at all. It was the late 1960s when the university finally got away from just letting legacies in. And I want to read this quote. William F. Buckley himself, the namesake of this discussion, complained about this. And he said his complaint was that if the university moved in this direction, the son of an alumnus who goes to a private preparatory school now has less chance of getting in than some boy from PS 109 somewhere. Some boy from PS. So that system's in place. There are thousands of men who were admitted to Yale before that change was made. They have grandchildren going into the university now, and that legacy status is also helping those overwhelmingly white Protestant. The university, still discriminated against Catholics back in the 1960s. That's all a plus. Yeah. We're going to leave that in place, and we're just going to take race away.
Yeah, we have to get to closing statements. But to be fair to Heather, the Harvard lawsuit, I guess they want to take down legacy too. So I think that their view is legacy's got to go as well. And I think Heather did start by saying she was happy to see that go. But I think we have to move to closing statements. So should we just wrap up? I don't know, Heather, do you want to wrap up, or since you went first, you want to go last this time? Whatever. Kevin, why don't you go, and then Heather, you can have the last word since you went first.
Sure, I'm glad to. Again, I want to say thanks to everybody, and thanks to Heather for this discussion. It's been great, and to you, Lisa. It's been very interesting. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. I'm not going to say anything particularly new, other than to just note that the American higher education system, particularly at elite levels, plays an enormously important role in the provision of opportunity and the structure of justice in our society. The judgment that individual private colleges have made around the importance of diversity from an educational standpoint is rooted in research. It is widespread. It is absolutely outside of the federal government's prerogative to second guess that. And there's also absolutely no way, practically speaking, that in some post-affirmative action ban regime, that it would be enforceable in a way that would not be completely confound the proper deference that the federal government ought to give to private institutions in terms of defining who they are, what they think education means, and what they're all about. So I think you're asking for trouble if that's what you want. The fact that we are singling out students who were completely denied access to this system for most of this country's history, who still to this day have to overcome many, many obstacles that other students don't, who very much believe in affirmative action, who think that it is in their best interest to go to these institutions, who want to go there, that we're going to say they're wrong as well. I think that's profoundly wrong. I think it would be bad law. I think it would be bad policy, and it shouldn't happen.
Yeah, and so just before close, just to correct this to the law. So when the Yale lawsuit is dropped, if Biden wins, this will not be the federal government second guessing. This will be courts. It will be white applicants suing. the universities. It will not be the federal government. So it'll be the judicial system enforcing, what they could perceive as constitutional rights. So I don't see in any world that the Yale lawsuit will continue if Biden wins. That's just my prediction. All right, Heather, you're closing.
Lisa, you had mentioned at some point the fact that, I think wrongly, Bakke Court Powell did reject compensatory role for affirmative action and ginned up this diversity rationale. The idea, and it's absolutely undeniable that this country has an appalling history of racism, of blindness to its foundational ideals, of a tolerance for hypocrisy that lasted centuries, that is inconceivable now. How ignorant, and callous and cruel majority institutions and a vast proportion of the American public could be. I would say we're in a different world today. The idea that the people that are being preferred to Yale and Harvard are coming out of some hard scrabble background is simply not the case, as we learned in the Harvard case. And again, all of this information is still buried at Yale. Believe me, it's going to come out and it's going to look very much like Harvard. Harvard prefers rich Blacks over poor Blacks. It gives rich Blacks a preference over poor whites. It has no interest in leveling socioeconomic disparities. Richard Kallenberg has argued again and again for using socioeconomic preferences for admissions. The schools refuse to do it because it doesn't give them their critical mass of underrepresented minority students to look out upon, because it turns out that white and Asian poor students are more academically qualified than Black poor students. So this is not at this point about compensating for undue economic disadvantage. It's about a racial essentialism that I do not think is appropriate at this point in our history. Race is different. Kevin rightly points out that there are other types of preferences. Obviously, the Singer scandal is just appalling. And these celebrity parents that are trying to credentialize their students through fraud is just an embarrassment. Nevertheless, race is different in this country. We have a very bad history. To quote, the Supreme Court justice, the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. I still believe mismatch is powerful. I think should be the most compelling argument, but the equity arguments are also there. And I think that we should start looking at the real problem, which is the academic skills gap, and not paper it over with a system of massive, unfair, and I would hope will finally decide unconstitutional racial preferences. And
so, I don't know, Kobe, I don't know how you want to, whether we're going to take questions from.
At this point, since we're at 5:30, we would have to end.
Okay.
But I can go ahead and end the call for us. Thank you again to our two guests and our wonderful moderator. I know I speak for the whole Buckley program when I say thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. So I'll end the call now and thank you again.